Good morning. Hopefully, after losing an hour of sleep, you won't fall asleep in my class or in my sermon today. I'm more worried about the sermon than I am the class. In the sermon, we're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant, so that's a subject that might put some people to sleep, but we'll power through it anyway.
You didn't hear what Tom said, Tom.
I ignored him. We call that selective hearing. We're still in Matthew chapter 19. We talked about this some last week when we got through the first 9 verses. Matthew chapter 19 is a major transition in Matthew's gospel. And, of course, we talked about how we're transitioning from one of the major discourses to now a big chunk of narrative. And, of course, included in the narrative are teachings like what we looked at last week about marriage and so on and so forth. But it is a major transition in Matthew in the sense that not only are we transitioning from discourse to narrative, but we're also beginning to see the shift in Jesus' ministry. As Matthew depicts it, the majority of Jesus' ministry takes place in or around the Galilean region. He spends a lot of time in Capernaum, and he spends a little bit of time in Nazareth, and there's other places that he spends a lot of time. Well, now we see that he has left Galilee, and he is entering the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. We read that in verse 1 last week. And so this is a major shift in Matthew's gospel. What we see happening here is Jesus' journey to Jerusalem has begun. And I have a reference here on the screen from Matthew 16 and verse 21. This is where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and this is, keep in mind, after Peter makes the confession, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. And then Jesus begins to explain what that actually means, namely in how he's going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests, he's going to be crucified, but he'll be raised on the 3rd day. And so Jesus' journey to Jerusalem has begun, and he'll reach Jerusalem in chapter 21 when he makes the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So we're leading up to this point. We're going to begin to slow things down a little bit. If you've thought we've went slow, wait till we get through this chunk here, because time really slows down, and all of the gospel writers do this to an extent. When you get to this last week or so, leading up to what's commonly called the Passion of Jesus, the word passion just means the suffering of Jesus. It comes from the Latin word. We're going to begin to slow down. And this means that Matthew wants us to notice some of these things. That's a rhetorical device that these gospel writers do, and Matthew is not an exception to that. So last week we covered the first 9 verses of this chapter. This is Jesus' teachings on marriage and also divorce. He's asked by the Pharisees about divorce. Can anyone divorce his wife for any cause? And we see what Jesus says about marriage here. And again, this is a controversial topic. We just stuck with what Jesus said. We're not going to try to add any of the other nonsense to it. And so what we see here and what Jesus says is that God has ordained marriage. That's an important point. It's created by God, marriages. Therefore, it's inherently good when it's in the proper context. And we see that proper context is it's between one man and one woman forever. Jesus goes on to say, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So we see here it's God that joins people together. It's not the preacher officiating the wedding. It's not the people who played matchmaker. It's none of that. It's God who joins the man and the woman together. We saw also that in this, it also kind of indirectly prohibits things like homosexuality, because it's a man and a woman, not a man and a man, not a woman and a woman. We also see that it prohibits polygamy, singular, one man, singular, one woman. Not any of the polygamous sort of things like you see in a lot of places today. And so we got through the first 9 verses. I was hoping to get through verse 12 last week, but we didn't have enough time. I talked for too long, some might say. And so we're going to pick up where we left off, getting to verse 10. And keep in mind, this is off the heels of what Jesus has said about marriage. He's answered the question by the Pharisees. And now the Pharisees kind of leave the scene. And now we see Jesus' disciples step up and they give a response to this teaching. And so verse 10 of Matthew chapter 19 says, "The disciples said to him, 'If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry.'" And so their conclusion after what Jesus has said, it's better to just not marry at all if you have to stick with one woman the whole time. Davies and Allison, they kind of point out the absurdity of this. This is one of the commentaries that I use for this study. And they put it this way in regards to the attitude of these disciples, where they say that they reason that a lifetime commitment to one woman is more burdensome than no involvement at all. Kind of points out the absurdity of what it is that they've said. This is obviously a misrepresentation of what Jesus has said. One thing that's interesting, this kind of becomes, and we've seen it already in Matthew, I think this is something that other gospel writers point out more, but Matthew again points out this thread as well, is the shortcomings of these disciples. And in this chapter in particular, in Matthew chapter 19, this is the first of three instances where the disciples show a lack of understanding. And it is still a lack of understanding. They've been in these intimate moments of teaching with Jesus, and they've had some breakthroughs, like Peter's confession in chapter 16, yet there's still instances where they don't get it. You see it in chapter 16 with Peter rebuking Jesus. You see it here in chapter 19 on three particular instances. One instance is here. They show a lack of understanding about what Jesus has said about marriage. I'll go into more details about that in a second. They do it again in verse 13. And we'll talk about that momentarily as well, Lord willing, where children are brought to Jesus and the disciples rebuke the people. That's another shortcoming on the disciples, a lack of understanding. And then later in verse 25, we'll talk about this, Lord willing, next week, when Jesus gives the teaching about the rich young man. And when Jesus says in verse 24, "It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God," the disciples heard this, and it says they're greatly astonished, saying, "Who then can be saved?" And so we see here in these three instances, the disciples still show a lack of understanding. And so that's something that Matthew, which by the way is one of these men, it's something that he's drawing out for us. And so the disciples, in their response in verse 10, in saying it is better not to marry, this shows that they have completely missed the point of what Jesus had been saying. Jesus' point in answering the question raised by the Pharisees in the first 9 verses, his point is he's exalting marriage, and he is exalting its sanctity in particular as God has designed it. God created marriage. God created it to be between one man and one woman. He created it to be together forever. God has joined them together. And so this is exalting marriage on the hand of Jesus. But their takeaway is actually a lower regard for marriage altogether. Jesus exalts it. They take it as a put down. And so we'll see Jesus respond to this in verses 11 and 12. "But he said to them, 'Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it.'" So Jesus answers their response in kind of an interesting way, because you can see how they're misrepresenting what Jesus says. You can, I think, pretty clearly see that. But Jesus seems to somewhat affirm what they're saying, despite it being a misrepresentation of what he's saying. And what he's pointing out here is the fact that what they've said is sometimes true for certain people, but not for everybody. Notice he says that this saying, the saying, I think, is what the disciples say in verse 10. There's this debate as to what this saying is, or these words, I think, is how it literally reads in the original language. If it's verses 1 through 9, or verses 1 through 10, or just verse 10, It seems, based on the context, it's just verse 10, what the disciples say. But he says that this is given to some. The key word there is given. It's given to some. He goes on to say, not everyone is able to receive this saying. That language of saying that it's given and received, this shows that this is a calling, and it's a calling for certain people. This is not a universal calling. There are certain things that God wills and desires for all people, namely that we be saved, right? God desires that for all people. But there are other things that God might desire in particular contexts for particular people. What God desires for me might be different than what God desires for you in certain areas. And this area is one such instance of that. This is a calling, and it's given to some, and it's received by some. And so it is given and received for and by certain people. And I want to elaborate on this a little more, because some people take this and they run with it, right? The idea of what Jesus says here, and you could tie it in with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as well. To say that this is a calling means that it is not a universal principle. Some people are called to this, but not all are. One way you can know that is, we talked about this before, I think it's in chapter 8, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. For Peter to have a mother-in-law means he was married. And so that's something to keep in mind here. And so some of the disciples, I don't know how many of them were, but some of them at least were married. Peter was married. John refers to himself as an elder. I don't know if that means he's an old person or if he was an actual elder of the church. We know to be an elder, you have to be the husband of one wife. And so there are things that make sense as to this not being a universal principle, despite what some might try to teach. Celibacy is what I'm going to refer to this as. He calls it being a eunuch. It seems kind of harsh to me in terms of that. Being celibate is not a means of self-righteousness. And this is what many in the religious world have taken and ran with today, using this as a form of asceticism. It's an extreme sense of self-denial, not for the purpose of personal growth, but for the purpose of self-righteousness. That is what happens a lot of times. And so what we see in this is that celibacy is not a means to self-righteous. If someone is celibate, they're not any more righteous necessarily than someone who's not celibate. A single person is not any more saved than a married person. That's just not the case, despite what some might try to portray. If this is the case, if celibacy is something that is self-worthy, then Jesus would have probably used himself as a moral example. He certainly could have done that, but he doesn't do that. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. The Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians 7, he uses himself as a personal example. He says, I wish everyone would be the way I am. He realizes, though, that that doesn't apply to all people. And so there are some things we need to remember when it comes to marriage and when it pertains to celibacy or being a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom, however you want to think of it. Some things to remember here. One, keep in mind what we've just studied in the first 9 verses. We see that marriage is created by God, therefore it's inherently good. There are obviously bad marriages out there, but that's man's fault, that's not God's fault. Just like anything that God creates, humanity has a tendency to take it and make it corrupted. You see that in particular with the way that our world, and in particular our society in America, takes marriage, to where marriage, it can be between any two people, no matter gender, sexuality, so on and so forth, and it can also be broken off for any reason. No-fault divorce has done a great deal of harm in our country. And so we see that marriage is created by God, and therefore it's inherently good within its proper context, that context being between one man and one woman forever. We see also, people will take 1 Corinthians 7, and I even did this to a kid at summer camp one time. I don't remember why, but I think he was crushing on a girl or something. I said, Paul says that it's better to be single than to be married. And he flipped out on me, and so I had to walk that back. 10-year-olds don't take too kindly to stuff like that, I learned. And so in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about how it's better, more or less, to stay in the context you're in. If you're single, it's better to stay single. If you're married, it's better to stay married, so on and so forth. But he does say in chapter 7 and verse 2 of 1 Corinthians that each person should have their own spouse in order to avoid temptation to sexual immorality. In other words, marriage is good. Marriage can be had by some people. And in this particular instance, it actually serves as a way to avoid temptation to sexual immorality. Another thing that's interesting to think about is what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 4. I'm going to just read that in its entirety because I think there's a lot to it, and it really holds a lot of weight as to what we're talking about. In 1 Timothy 4, the first 5 verses, Paul says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons through the insincerity of liars whose consequences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and prayer." And so here in this section of 1 Timothy 4, Paul talks about two things. One is the food, right? The abstinence from food. That pertains, I believe, to Judaism and ceremonially clean and unclean food and so on and so forth. But then he also mentions those who forbid marriage. So the forbidding of marriage is mentioned on here in 1 Timothy chapter 4. And what he says about this is, and this is, keep in mind, the Spirit saying this, not just Paul, that some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to these deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. And what he says of that is, among these is the forbiddance of marriage. And so according to Paul, to forbid marriage in a universal sense is a departure of the faith. It is devotion to deceitful spirits and to demonic doctrine. So we don't want to do that. That's not what Jesus is saying here when he talks about those who are made eunuchs for the purpose of, or for the sake of the kingdom. So it's a departure of the faith, and it's a devotion to demonic doctrine to forbid marriage. And there are a lot who do that. You could probably think of certain religious groups and so on who do that for certain people. Another thing we see is, let's just say, of not being married is better for all. That's kind of the inverse of what I'm trying to say. If it's better to not be married for all people, in other words, if no one is supposed to be married, first of all, how can you populate the earth? Just thinking of it simply, you can't do that while being moral. You do that within the confines of marriage. But another thing is, if it's better to not be married for all people, then why would God have among the qualifications of being an elder to be the husband of one wife? And so we can see, logically speaking, that this is not a prohibition for all people. Rather, it is a calling for some people, for certain people. And who those certain people are, I don't know. It's probably up to the individual to make that decision. And so, to illustrate Jesus' point, and I say this as an illustration because he references eunuchs. We're not talking about the physical castration of individuals here. Some people do take it to that point, to make themselves a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom. Jesus isn't saying to do that. But to illustrate this point, Jesus talks about eunuchs. I'll read again from verse 12. "For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive this receive it." So in verse 12, Jesus talks about these eunuchs. The word that's used in the original language is literally eunuch. The word in particular is eunuchos, I think is how you pronounce that. I could see it better if I had the actual Greek up there, but when it's transliterated into English, I struggle with it. And this can refer, actually, this kind of has a broad meaning to it. On the one hand, it can refer to a literal castrated male. I'm not going to explain what that means. You know what that means. Or it can also refer to someone who is incapable of having children. In other words, someone who is impotent. And so it can be used broadly in either case. And even BDAG Lexicon actually has the sense that Jesus uses it for the kingdom as a third definition, those who are celibate. In other words, it's not a physical eunuch, but a spiritual one. And so he points out that there are three kinds of eunuchs. There are those who've been eunuchs from birth, whether that is someone with a defect in that regard, or whether it's someone who is impotent, someone who simply can't physically reproduce. I think either of those would apply to that. You also have eunuchs who are made so by man. It was pretty common, as I understand it, in that period of time, for servants of kings to be made eunuchs as a sign of loyalty and as a preventative measure so that they wouldn't get caught up in lady troubles, so on and so forth. We're going to actually see, well, we're not going to study it, but you see in the book of Acts, one of the first conversions in Acts of particular people that's mentioned is an Ethiopian eunuch, someone who was the treasurer for the queen of Ethiopia. And so that's someone who was made a eunuch by man, by working as a worker of that particular kingdom in Ethiopia. So you have those who are eunuchs from birth, those who are made eunuchs by man, and then those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Notice it's for the sake of the kingdom. There's terms that you hear thrown out, like someone who is involuntarily celibate. The word that's used for that is an incel. That means someone who can't get married because no one wants to marry them, that kind of a thing. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. This is someone who is willingly becoming celibate for the sake of the kingdom. And so there are these three kinds of eunuchs, and notice some of the distinctions that Jesus makes in some of these regards. One is a eunuch by natural circumstances, either a defect from birth or some sort of other circumstances, but one is by natural circumstances. One is done to the person by another, such as someone who's working as a servant of a king or a queen. They are made a eunuch so that they could hold that office. But then one is done by the person, and it's done for the sake of the kingdom. And notice, again, I'll point this out, some of these are physical, but when it comes to someone being made a eunuch for the purposes of the kingdom, that is a spiritual sort of a castration or whatever you want to call it. That's not physical. Some people take it to that point, but I don't think that's necessary. I think Jesus is speaking hyperbolically here in that sense. Just like when he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. He's not saying you have to literally gouge your eye out. He's using hyperbole in that sense, just as I think he is here. And so Jesus comes to this conclusion at the end of verse 12. Let the one who's able to receive this, receive it. And so again, in that language of talking about someone receiving it, we see that this is not a universal requirement for all people. If it were, we wouldn't be here today, simply put. But instead, it's a calling, and it's given for specific people, people who, by the way, are able to receive it. I think this also shows us that Jesus isn't going to require this of someone who's not going to be able to keep it. It's a special kind of person who is able to do this. And so this is interesting when you have this teaching about eunuchs for the kingdom in comparison to what Jesus says about marriage in the first 9 verses. There's almost sort of a juxtaposition going on here between marriage and what we'll call celibacy in this chapter and in these first 12 verses. It begins with Jesus exalting marriage as it's been ordained by God, not as society defines it. Then we see the disciples, they tear down marriage in favor of celibacy. They say, well, it's better to not marry if we have to be bound to one woman for the whole time. That's crazy talk, Jesus. So the disciples tear down that idea, but Jesus, it's not as if one has to be raised and exalted in opposition to the other one. Jesus raises and exalts both of them for their specific people. He exalts celibacy, but only for those who can receive it. Davies and Allison puts it this way, and I like the way they put it. These are scholarly people, and they find words that aren't easy for me to find. It says, for these people, they're speaking of those who have this calling. For these people, the good and valuable thing that marriage undoubtedly is, see verses 3 through 9, when Jesus exalts marriage. For these people, the good and valuable thing that marriage undoubtedly is must be turned down, surrendered, or sacrificed in view of the demand made upon them by something greater. That something greater being, of course, the kingdom. For some people, the demands of the kingdom usurp the demands of having a marriage. And you could look at the Apostle Paul as a great example of that. Could you imagine if Paul was married, how big of a hindrance he would be in that marriage, constantly going all over the place, never being home, not having a place to lie his head, just as Jesus didn't have a place to lie his head, constantly being in prison, being abused, so on and so forth. It was a great benefit for Paul to not be married. That would have, for his work for the kingdom, that would have hindered him. And for some people that is the case, for other people that's not the case. This is obviously not a universal thing. Next, Jesus is going to talk about children. Kind of an interesting thread we see here. Marriage, and then eunuchs, and now children. Before we get there, are there any comments or questions? I begrudgingly ask that, but I will ask it. I reserve the right to turn down your question. Everett?
It's not really a question. There's a group historically called the Shakers. You ever do any research on the Shakers?
A little bit.
They're not around anymore. And it's because they didn't believe in procreation. They believe in marriage. So they were the ones that they're forbid. What you read from 1 Timothy, they were forbidding marriage and didn't believe in that. And they're no longer in existence as an religious group. So that just shows you the consequences of a wrong kind of theology.
Yeah, Everett talks about a group of people, the Shakers, is that what you call them? You said that, and I thought of the Quakers, but you're talking about a different group. The Shakers. And these are people who strictly forbid marriage, and they're not around anymore because they all died off, more or less. When you forbid marriage, you can't procreate in a moral way, and so, as they say, the rest is history. CJ?
This teaching on marriage, it really, if Jesus were to stand up a large crowd and give this teaching, marriage is so good, you know what he would get? Well, Jesus, that's really just a piece of paper. Jesus' teaching on marriage is so radical to some people, and it's radical to our world because marriage is not valued, and because we define marriage so much in this society. So Jesus really teaches us to value marriage and what God intended for it.
You didn't hear CJ. He talks about how today's society more or less views marriage as nothing more than just a piece of paper given to you by the state. And when we devalue marriage in that sense, that's why you see people allow men to marry men and women to marry women, and why you can break off a marriage for no reason, the no-fault divorce sort of thing. Jesus is showing us here to have a high value of marriage as God has created it. I think that's what you're saying. Don?
God adds two people together when they're married. They're not, and becoming a Christian, you don't join the church. God adds you to the church, so he has these two people that's getting married, he adds them in marriage. And the preacher don't have much to do with it, just the ceremony. And we don't have anything to do with voting people in if they can be a Christian. God adds them to the church.
Yeah, Don, he actually told me this last week. I'm glad you pointed it out because I forgot about what you said. He talks about how it's God who joins people together when it comes to marriage, just as it's the Lord who adds people to his church in that sense. It's not something initiated by us. It's something that the Lord does. It's the Lord who joins people together. It's the Lord who adds people to his church. That's a good connection there. All right, so next we come to this story, and it's another story pertaining to children. Before we read this section, let me just point out, children seem to be of a special interest in Matthew's gospel account because there are different instances where children are sort of brought to the forefront. And this is what some refer to, and I think this is a theme that's more drawn out in Luke in particular, but you might hear this sometimes referred to as the kingdom reversal, where sometimes you have those who are more lowly. Well, Jesus tends to exalt them. And this is a case of that when it pertains in particular to children. And so you see in numerous cases that children are recipients of many of the miracles that Jesus does. You can think of when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter. That's a child who's raised from the dead. There's boys that have demons cast out of them. There are a variety of miracles where children are the beneficiaries of it. In addition to stories like the feeding of the 5,000 or the feeding of the 4,000, where there's the great number that's mentioned there, and Matthew adds, plus the women and the children. And so children are frequently the beneficiaries of some of these miracles that Jesus has done that we've seen in Matthew's gospel account. Another thing we saw this a couple weeks ago when we studied chapter 18, where Jesus uses children as an example of those who are the greatest in the kingdom. I'll read that again in chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. And keep in mind, this is prompted by Jesus' disciples asking in verse 1, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Other gospel accounts tell us that they're asking who the greatest is among themselves. And so it's kind of a prideful place to ask that question. And Jesus does a great job of humbling them in his response. It says he called him a child and he put him in the midst of them and he said, this is Matthew 18 starting in verse 3, truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And so we see Jesus use children as an example, not just as the greatest in the kingdom, but you've got to be like this child to even enter the kingdom. And so it's not even so much about being the greatest, it's about just being in the kingdom, period. You've got to be humble like these children. The children are the example. Later, this is a story we'll get to as Jesus enters Jerusalem in what's referred to as the triumphal entry. He's entering in and there are children there who recognize Jesus as the Son of David, and they say, Hosanna. So I'll read this. This is as Jesus is entering Jerusalem in chapter 21. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And so we see children playing a pretty prominent role here in Matthew's gospel account. And this is going to be no exception here when we read verses 13 through 15. It says, then children were brought to him being Jesus, that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people. But Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. And he laid hands on them and went away. And so now you have this story where once again children are brought to the forefront of the picture. These children are brought to Jesus. And in particular, the purpose behind this is for Jesus to lay hands on them and pray. We're not sure why he was going to lay hands on them. We know that the laying on of hands could be for multiple things. Perhaps it's something that needs to be healed, although he doesn't mention that. Matthew doesn't. Or perhaps it is done for the purpose of giving a blessing. That's another reason you might lay hands on someone in that sense So, regardless of the reason, children are brought to Jesus, and they want Jesus to lay hands on them and pray. And what we see, I mentioned this earlier, the disciples rebuke the people, presumably the people who brought the children to Jesus. And so once again, we see their lack of understanding is on display. Makes me think of what God says, I forget where it is in the Old Testament. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. We see that a lack of knowledge is really hindering Jesus' disciples here. And it makes you wonder. This is not that far removed from what Jesus has taught in chapter 18. Have they forgotten Jesus' words about children? Not just the fact that it's the children, to be like children is to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, but what Jesus says in verse 5 of that chapter, when he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. This couldn't have been that long ago. I know Jesus has done some traveling since then, leaving Galilee, coming to the region of Judea beyond the river. But the disciples were there for that, you could assume. And yet, they're missing this when we get here to chapter 19. They are rebuking the people for bringing children to Jesus. Yet Jesus had said to receive, or whoever receives such child in my name receives me. So this raises the question, why would the disciples rebuke these people for bringing these children? There's not really a good explanation. I don't know if maybe they see the writing on the wall and they realize their time with Jesus is getting shorter, and so they want to shove people away. I don't know if it's that. Some speculate that there's a connection with verses 10 through 12, which makes a little bit of sense. Because keep in mind what they said in verse 10, where they say it's better not to marry. And so if their low view of marriage, unless Jesus has corrected that, which I would hope that they would listen to Jesus' teachings on marriage. And some of them we know were married, like Peter. But their low view of marriage perhaps translates to a low view of families and children as well. I don't know if I buy that, but that's what some people speculate as to why they would rebuke these people. Maybe the disciples were just in a bad mood or something. I don't know. Regardless of the reason why they rebuke these people, that's obviously wrong. And now Jesus is going to respond to this. He says in verse 14, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them. Do you remember what Jesus said in chapter 18? And this is, keep in mind, fresh off of what we just read from chapter 18 and verse 5, where he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the depth of the sea. So here he says, don't hinder them. Well, that coincides with what he says in chapter 18, where he talks about causing one of them to stumble. There's a connection here. And we need to remember the humility that is seen in children is what Christ is looking for in disciples. That's the base point for entering the kingdom, as he says in chapter 18. And interestingly, this is the same humility that Jesus himself is going to show when he goes to the cross. Just as Paul puts it in Philippians chapter 2. Jesus humbled himself, taking on the likeness of man, humbling himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so this humility that Jesus is speaking of, this is something that's considered valuable in the kingdom. To be the greatest in the kingdom is to have this same childlike humility. And this is the same humility that Jesus himself has been showing and will ultimately show in going to the cross. Notice what else Jesus says. He says, I'm still in chapter 18. No wonder that looked funny. Jesus says, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. We need to remember, again, one must become like children to enter the kingdom. Not just being the greatest in the kingdom, but to even enter the kingdom. You have to have this childlike humility. And so we see once again the exaltation of what was in that period of time, and perhaps still is, a marginalized and overthought group of people thinking of children. Something that's interesting to think about in this regard, thinking about children, thinking about humility in particular, I think that's the main point that Jesus is getting at in making this point with children, is the humility seen in children. That's certainly the case that he makes in chapter 18. Compare this, and you have a similar statement here about, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. Compare this with what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 in the bookends of the Beatitudes. You see in verse 3 of Matthew 5, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." This is someone who's in a humbled, lowly state, someone who's poor in spirit, someone who, Jim likes to say, someone who is broke in spirit. And so this is a blessing to be poor in spirit because of the kingdom, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And you tie that in with the bookend toward the end in verse 10, where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Here you have in the Beatitudes, in the blessings that Jesus gives, the bookends pertaining to the kingdom of heaven, and you have two humbled states of people. You have those who are the poor in spirit, and then you have those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Not those who are persecuted for any reason, but in particular those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And so you see kind of the thread that we see going on here, this idea of humility. Humility is a big value when it comes to the kingdom. It's something that is expected of those who are citizens of the kingdom, and it's certainly something that is shown in our King. In this interaction, it highlights a major feature of the kingdom, that feature being humility, and this is actually going to be expounded upon later toward the end of this chapter, getting into chapter 20. The very last words of chapter 19 are, "But many who are first will be last, and the last first." You see here again this sort of kingdom reversal. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. Jesus expounds on that again in chapter 20 and verse 16, where he says, "So the last will be first, and the first last." And so you have a reversal here. Those who are humble, God will exalt. Those who exalt themselves, God will humble. Other writings in the New Testament make this point, such as in James chapter 4. And so what we see here is that humility is of great value when it pertains to the kingdom, as opposed to the haughtiness or the self-righteousness or the pride that was really quite commonplace in the Jewish religion at that particular period of time. You can look at the Pharisees. They would pat themselves on the backs, right? Jesus makes that point in Matthew chapter 6. They would do all these things in order to be seen by others, namely giving to the needy and praying and fasting. They did those things not to give glory to God, but to give glory to themselves. This was commonplace in that period of time, and Jesus is putting a stop to that. This isn't a matter of self-righteousness. This is a matter of being humble and God exalting you. Any last-second comments or questions? That clock says we have like an hour. That one didn't get rolled forward. Garfield?
I was going to mention one of the things that you notice about children. It says we got to become like little children. Children will fight among themselves, and if parents will stay out of it, a lot of times they got their arms around one another in the evening. They're still buddies again.
Oh, yeah?
They forgive, they forget, they go on.
Yeah. Garfield points out when kids fight, they're usually pretty quick to make up. I know that was my experience when I was a kid. And usually the ones I fought with were some of my best buddies, but we always made up at the end. There is a level of humility there. All right, thanks.